The bat connected with full force. The men in the passenger seat laughed, expecting the familiar crack of wood in the mailbox, exploding into pieces like it always did. Instead, there was a violent metallic bang so loud it shook the windows of the house. Pain ripped through his arm instantly, sharp and unbearable, as the bat snapped in half and the truck screeched forward in panic. In that single moment, he realized something was very, very wrong. The mailbox was still standing. If you've ever wanted to see a bully finally get punished by their own arrogance, you're going to love this one. Smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and stay with me until the end, because this revenge wasn't loud or illegal. It was quiet, legal, and absolutely devastating. Years before that night, before the screams and the broken baseball bat, Professor Harris lived a simple, predictable life in a quiet university town. He was an engineering professor, respected by his students and known for being calm, patient, and painfully fair. The kind of man who believed problems had solutions and that most people, given enough time, would eventually do the right thing. That belief was tested the moment his mailbox became someone else's favorite target. The first time it happened, he thought it was an accident. A careless driver, maybe someone distracted or drunk. He replaced the mailbox himself, carefully setting the post and making sure it met every city regulation. 2 nights later, it was destroyed again. This time there was no doubt it was intentional. The wooden post had been shattered cleanly, splinters scattered across the roadside. A neighbor mentioned seeing a red pickup truck speeding away, but there was no license plate, no proof, and no one to hold accountable. By the 3rd and 4th mailbox, the pattern was undeniable. Same time of night, same red truck, same cruel efficiency. A bat swung from the passenger side window, smashing whatever Professor Harris had just installed days earlier. Police reports went nowhere. Without witnesses or plates, the vandal knew he was untouchable. That confidence was the worst part. This wasn't random destruction. It was someone enjoying the power of doing harm without consequences. Each morning after an attack felt heavier than the last. Professor Harris's wife stopped walking down the driveway to check the mail. Instead, she'd pause by the window first, bracing herself for disappointment. Sometimes she sighed in frustration. Sometimes she just turned away. It wasn't about the cost anymore. It was about the disrespect. About knowing that no matter how calm or decent you were, someone out there had decided you were weak enough to target. That feeling of being powerless while someone keeps crossing the line slowly burned away Professor Harris's patience. Not into rage, but into resolve. If the law couldn't stop the vandal, and confrontation would only make things worse, then there was only one place left to turn. His classroom. One afternoon, he walked into his engineering lecture, carrying the twisted remains of what used to be mailbox number 5. He set it down on the desk and waited until the room fell silent. Then, in a calm, controlled voice, he explained the situation. The repeated vandalism, the red truck, the baseball bat, the complete lack of consequences. Finally, he issued the challenge that changed everything. Design a mailbox that can survive being hit by a truck. Follow city regulations. Stay under a $20 budget. Extra credit for anyone who succeeds. The room shifted instantly. Engineering students leaned forward in their seats. Because engineers don't get angry in the way most people do. They get focused. They see limits as puzzles and unfairness as something that can be corrected with the right design. And sitting in that classroom were 2 students who took the challenge. Personally, my dad and his best friend, Uncle Dale. Dale was quiet, methodical, and stubborn in the best possible way. When he heard the assignment, he didn't smile or joke. He simply nodded, already thinking about materials, force, weight, and momentum. He wasn't interested in scaring the vandal. He wanted something far more effective. He wanted physics to deliver the lesson. And from that moment on, the fate of that red truck, and the men who swung the bat, was sealed. When the lecture finally ended, most students packed their bags and filed out, still joking about the absurdity of the assignment. A truck-proof mailbox sounded funny on the surface, almost cartoonish. But my dad and Uncle Dale didn't laugh. They stayed seated long after the room had emptied. The broken remains of Professor Harris's mailbox still sitting at the front of the classroom, like a challenge that hadn't been fully accepted yet. There was a heaviness in the air between them. The kind that comes when a problem stops being academic and starts feeling personal. Dale leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, staring at the twisted metal, and finally said, "Whoever's doing this thinks he's untouchable." My dad nodded. That was the moment this stopped being about extra credit. That evening, they met at the library, spreading city code printouts and engineering textbooks across a long wooden table. The rules were strict. The mailbox post had to be within a specific height, width, and depth. Nothing about the design could pose a danger to pedestrians. It had to look ordinary. And the total cost couldn't exceed $20. Most people would have seen limitations. To them, it felt like a roadmap. Every rule narrowed the problem, and a narrowed problem is easier to solve. As they worked through the regulations line by line, one truth became obvious. The previous mailboxes failed because they absorbed impact. Wood cracked. Thin metal bent. Energy went into destruction. What they needed was something that refused to give. They began running numbers. The speed of a truck passing at night. The mass of a human arm swinging a baseball bat. Momentum. Transfer of force. If the mailbox didn't move, that energy had to go somewhere. Dale tapped the table thoughtfully and said, "If it doesn't break and it doesn't move, the force goes back." That sentence changed everything. They weren't designing something to survive the hit. They were designing something that would punish it. The next day, they drove out to a scrapyard on the edge of town. The kind of place filled with rusted steel and forgotten machinery. The owner barely looked up when they explained what they were searching for. After an hour of digging through scrap, they found it, a solid steel bar. Thick enough to be absurd, yet still within city code dimensions. It was heavy, awkward, and perfect. The owner charged them almost nothing for it. Probably happy to get rid of something so difficult to move. As they loaded it into the car, Dale smiled for the first time since the project began. Back at Dale's garage, the real work started. They cut and measured steel rebar, sliding it into the hollow core of the post before pouring in concrete. Slowly, methodically, they turned an ordinary-looking post into a solid mass of steel, stone, and reinforcement. As the concrete settled, the weight increased beyond anything a passing truck could realistically dislodge. They weren't rushing. Every step was deliberate. Every choice was calculated. This wasn't anger driving them. It was focus. But they still weren't satisfied. A strong post wasn't enough. If the base could be uprooted, the whole structure would fail. That's when Dale came up with the anchor. A heavy-duty bucket was reinforced with welded rebars, bent outward like roots. They filled it with the heaviest rocks they could find, layering them until the bucket felt immovable. This would be buried underground, hidden from sight, locking the mailbox into the earth itself. The center of gravity would sit deep below the surface. Any lateral force applied at the top would meet absolute resistance. The finishing touches mattered more than people would expect. They painted the post brown and black, carefully blending colors to make it resemble aged wood. They didn't want it to look threatening. They wanted it to look boring. Invisible. Just another mailbox begging to be destroyed. For the mailbox itself, they bought the ugliest, cheapest model on sale. Thin metal. Faded paint. Something that screamed, easy target. Then they welded it to the post permanently. No screws. No weak points. When they finally dragged the completed mailbox into class, it took both of them to move it. Other students stared, whispering, some laughing, some clearly impressed. Professor Harris approached slowly, running a hand along the painted surface, his expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief. "You're serious," he said quietly. Dale nodded. "Bury the bucket where the old mailbox was. The rest will take care of itself." The professor hesitated for just a second before agreeing. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he trusted his students. Or maybe he just wanted the nightmare to end. That evening, the mailbox was installed under cover of dusk. The bucket disappeared into the ground. The post stood upright, unassuming, ordinary. Professor Harris and his wife stood back and looked at it, neither daring to hope too much. To anyone driving by, it looked exactly like every other mailbox that had been destroyed before. And somewhere out there, a red truck was already on its way, completely unaware that tonight would not end the way it always had. That night, the mailbox stood alone at the edge of the road. Perfectly ordinary, perfectly unremarkable. The brown and black paint blended into the darkness. The cheap metal box on top slightly crooked, just like every mailbox that had come before it. If you didn't know what was buried beneath the surface, you would never look at it twice. That was exactly the point. My dad and Uncle Dale had done their job too well. There was nothing about it that warned anyone. No signs. No deterrence. No intimidation. It looked like an invitation. Professor Harris tried to act normal that evening, but the tension sat heavy in his chest. Dinner tasted bland. Conversation with his wife drifted and stalled. Every few minutes, his eyes flicked toward the front window, half expecting headlights to appear early. They had lived through this cycle enough times to know how it usually went. Late night. Engine noise. A loud crack. Then silence. Clean up in the morning. Except tonight, everything felt different. Not hopeful exactly, but resolved. Like the ending of a long argument, where you finally say what needs to be said and wait for the response. When it got late, they turned off the lights and went to bed, though neither of them slept easily. Professor Harris lay staring at the ceiling, replaying the day in his mind. He thought about his students, about the quiet confidence in the way Dale had spoken, about the calculations he didn't fully understand but trusted completely. Part of him felt uneasy. What if it worked too well? What if someone got hurt? Then another part of him remembered the months of vandalism. The humiliation, the feeling of being targeted for no reason at all. He clenched his jaw and let the thoughts fade into the dark. Across town, the red truck was already rolling. This wasn't a spontaneous act. It never was. The driver knew the route by heart. The passenger leaned out the window, baseball bat resting casually against the door. The wood scarred and chipped from repeated use. To them, this was a game. A ritual. The same house. The same mailbox. Same laugh, same swing, same destruction. There was no fear, no hesitation. Why would there be? They had done this before. Nothing ever happened. As the truck turned onto the street, its headlights swept across the road, briefly illuminating the mailbox ahead. The passenger grinned. "Looks like he put another one up," he said, already shifting his grip on the bat. The driver laughed and eased the truck closer, lining it up perfectly. The mailbox stood still, silent, waiting. Inside the house, Professor Harris's eyes snapped open. The low rumble of an engine drifted through the walls. His heart rate spiked instantly. He sat up in bed, holding his breath, listening. His wife stirred beside him, already knowing what was coming. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The sound of tires on pavement grew louder, closer, until it was right outside. Time slowed. The truck passed the mailbox at just the right angle. The passenger leaned out, muscles tensing. Bat swinging back in a smooth, practiced arc. This was muscle memory now. He wasn't even looking closely. He didn't need to. In his mind, the outcome was already decided. The bat came down with full force. What followed was not the familiar crack of wood or the hollow clang of thin metal. It was a deep, violent metallic impact that echoed through the street like an explosion. The sound was so loud it rattled the windows of the house. At the same instant, a sharp, animal scream cut through the night, raw and full of pain. Inside the truck, chaos erupted. The bat shattered on impact. The shockwave ripping through the passenger's arms, slamming into his shoulder with brutal force. Pain exploded through his body, immediate and overwhelming. He screamed again, dropping what was left of the bat as the truck swerved wildly. "Go! Go! Go!" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. The driver floored it, tires squealing as the truck tore down the street, leaving behind nothing but scattered wood fragments and silence. Professor Harris and his wife were already out of bed. They rushed to the window just in time to see the red truck disappear around the corner. The mailbox stood exactly where it had been before. Upright. Unmoved. At its base lay the broken remains of a wooden baseball bat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Professor Harris felt a strange mix of emotions wash over him: shock, disbelief, and something dangerously close to relief. He hadn't confronted anyone. He hadn't broken the law. He had simply allowed physics to enforce boundaries that words and warnings never could. That night, for the first time in months, the street went quiet again. And somewhere, not very far away, someone was learning that arrogance has a price. The next morning, the street looked exactly the same as it always had. And yet everything felt different. The mailbox still stood at attention, straight and unscarred, as if nothing had happened at all. Professor Harris walked down the driveway slowly, half expecting to see damage out of habit, half expecting the illusion to break. But there was nothing to fix. No splintered wood. No bent metal. Just a quiet, ordinary mailbox doing its job. At the base, however, lay the evidence of the night before: the broken end of a wooden baseball bat. Cracked clean through, abandoned in a hurry. He stared at it for a long moment, then picked it up and turned it over in his hands. For the first time since the vandalism began, he smiled. Word spread quickly through the department. Students whispered about it between classes, piecing together what had happened from rumors and fragments. By the afternoon, most people had heard some version of the story. The loud bang, the scream, the red truck fleeing the scene. My dad and Uncle Dale didn't brag. They didn't need to. They exchanged a look when they passed the mailbox later that day. A quiet acknowledgement that the design had done exactly what it was supposed to do. Physics had been fair, impersonal, final. 2 days later, something unexpected arrived at Professor Harris's house. It wasn't hate mail. It wasn't another threat. It was an envelope from a hospital. Inside was an itemized bill detailing emergency treatment for a fractured arm and a damaged shoulder. Along with it came a notice that legal action was being considered. The implication was clear. The same people who had spent months destroying property without consequence were now demanding accountability for their own injuries. Professor Harris read the papers carefully, his expression tightening with disbelief. There it was in black and white. They were claiming negligence, claiming the mailbox was dangerous, claiming they were the victims. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Had he gone too far? Had trusting his students crossed some invisible line? But that doubt didn't last long. Because the truth was painfully simple. He hadn't set a trap. He hadn't hidden spikes or violated code. He had installed a mailbox that followed every regulation. What happened next was the result of a choice someone else made. Still, he didn't take chances. He contacted a lawyer that same afternoon and laid out the entire situation from the beginning. The repeated vandalism, the police reports, the assignment, the regulations, the construction, the impact. The lawyer listened without interrupting, then leaned back in his chair and smiled. Not a reassuring smile. A dangerous one. So, the lawyer said slowly, they're willing to testify under oath that they were repeatedly vandalizing your property at night. From a moving vehicle, using a baseball bat. He paused, letting the implication sink in. Because that's what this lawsuit would require. The threat evaporated almost instantly. The lawyer drafted a response that didn't argue or apologize. It simply stated facts. Any legal action would require admitting to criminal vandalism, endangerment, and property damage over an extended period of time. Any testimony would open the door to police involvement. The letter ended politely, professionally, and decisively. There would be no settlement. There would be no payout. The response was never challenged. Days passed. Then weeks. The red truck never returned. No new threats appeared. No further complaints were made. The silence was complete. Professor Harris felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't realized had been missing. Not triumph. Not revenge. Closure. The problem had ended not with shouting or fists, but with consequences that were impossible to argue against. Around town, other professors began accepting mailbox gifts from students who had taken the assignment seriously. Different designs, different materials, same principle. None of them were ever vandalized again. It was as if an unspoken rule had been established overnight. Some lessons don't need signs or warnings. They just need to be learned once. My dad and Uncle Dale never framed it as revenge. To them, it was a successful solution to a poorly defined problem. But every time Professor Harris walked past that mailbox, standing firm against time and weather, he was reminded of something far more important. Patience doesn't mean weakness. Intelligence doesn't need to announce itself. And sometimes, the most powerful response to disrespect is to build something so solid that it speaks for you. And that mailbox, to the best of anyone's knowledge, it's still standing. Life didn't suddenly turn dramatic after that. There were no late-night confrontations. No angry letters taped to doors. No final showdowns in courtrooms. Instead, something far more powerful happened. Nothing. The streets stayed quiet. Nights passed without engines revving or bats swinging out of windows. The red truck became a story people told in lowered voices. A cautionary tale that faded into rumor and then into memory. For Professor Harris and his wife, the silence was everything. It meant sleep without anxiety, mornings without dread. A return to the simple routine that had been stolen from them for months. Every time Professor Harris walked down his driveway and saw the mailbox still standing, straight and unmoved, he felt a calm sense of validation. Not satisfaction in someone else's pain, but reassurance that he hadn't been wrong to trust his instincts, his students, and the system when applied correctly. The mailbox became a quiet symbol of boundaries. A reminder that kindness doesn't require surrender and that being patient doesn't mean accepting abuse forever. For my dad and Uncle Dale, the story took on a different meaning over time. They didn't tell it like a revenge story. They told it like an engineering problem that finally had a clean solution. Years later, whenever it came up, Dale would shrug and say, "We just followed the rules." But there was always a pause after that, a knowing look. Because both of them understood the deeper truth. They hadn't broken any laws. They hadn't set a trap. They had simply built something that refused to fail when challenged by stupidity. What made this revenge so satisfying wasn't the injury or the fear or the hospital bill. It was the inevitability of it. The vandals weren't outsmarted in a dramatic confrontation. They weren't threatened or chased away. They were allowed to make the same bad choice they'd been making all along. And for the first time, that choice came with consequences they couldn't escape. Karma didn't arrive screaming. It arrived welded, reinforced, and buried deep in the ground. There's a lesson in that which sticks with you. You don't always need to fight louder or hit harder. Sometimes the strongest response is to quietly remove the weakness someone is exploiting. To stop absorbing the damage and start refusing to bend. When you do that, people who rely on intimidation and recklessness tend to defeat themselves. If this story left you smiling, if it gave you that deep sense of justice that only the best revenge stories deliver, make sure you hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more real stories where arrogance meets consequences. And tell me in the comments, what's the most satisfying, quiet revenge you've ever seen? Because sometimes, the best victories don't need applause. They just need to last.